Julian Myers had always found solace in the art of cultivation. As a former botanist with years of research behind her, she had spent much of her life experimenting with plant hybrids and cultivating rare species. After leaving the chaos of the corporate lab environment, Julian craved a simpler life, one that allowed her to reconnect with nature on her own terms. That dream led her to a quiet suburban community, where she purchased a modest but charming property with a large backyard. It wasn't just any backyard, it was fertile land, the perfect canvas for her new venture. Julian envisioned rows of vibrant grapevines, a small but meaningful vineyard that could stand as both a personal sanctuary and a tribute to the legacy of her late father, who had first taught her the joys of working with plants. The first few months in her new home were blissful. Julian threw herself into the project with the meticulous passion of a scientist and the hopeful heart of an artist. She spent hours each day preparing the soil, carefully selecting the varieties of grapevines that would thrive in the local climate. Her choices weren't random, they reflected her years of expertise and a desire to innovate. Julian wasn't interested in creating a typical vineyard. She wanted to grow hybrid grapes with unique flavor profiles, blending science and art into something that was uniquely her own. By early summer, the vineyard began to take shape. The trellises stood tall, supporting rows of young vines that seemed to stretch toward the sun. Neighbors who passed by often stopped to compliment her work, some even expressing admiration for the dedication she poured into the project. "You've turned this place into something special," an elderly neighbor named Marjorie said one afternoon, leaning over the fence with a warm smile. Julian, despite her reserved nature, felt a sense of pride in these interactions. Her vineyard wasn't just for her, it brought a quiet charm to the neighborhood. However, not everyone shared Marjorie's enthusiasm. One afternoon, as Julian was watering her vines, a man in a crisp suit approached her property. He introduced himself as Robert Longstreet, the president of the local homeowners association, HOA. With a tone that balanced between forced politeness and thinly veiled authority, he complimented her work, but the conversation quickly took a sharp turn. "We've received a few concerns from board members about the aesthetic impact of your vineyard," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "While it's clear you've put a lot of effort into this, we need to ensure all properties in the community adhere to certain standards." Julian blinked, unsure of how to respond. "Aesthetic impact. I wasn't aware that planting a vineyard would be an issue," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Longstreet smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, it's not explicitly prohibited in the bylaws, but there are certain expectations about maintaining a cohesive neighborhood appearance. We'd like you to consider scaling it back or perhaps removing it entirely." The suggestion felt like a slap in the face. Julian had reviewed the HOA guidelines extensively before starting her project and found nothing that prohibited her vineyard. She said as much, but Longstreet's response was vague, bordering on evasive. "The board has the discretion to interpret the bylaws as needed," he said before leaving with a nonchalant wave. Julian stood by her vines, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. It was clear that this wasn't about the vineyard itself, but something more, an attempt to assert control. For the next few weeks, Julian tried to ignore the encounter, focusing instead on nurturing her vines. But the tension lingered. A few other neighbors, previously warm and supportive, seemed to grow distant, their smiles more hesitant, their conversations shorter. Julian suspected that Longstreet had started to influence opinions within the community, sowing subtle seeds of dissent. Still, she refused to back down. The vineyard was her passion, her livelihood, and her sanctuary. She wasn't going to abandon it because of vague threats. Then came the first official letter. Delivered in a crisp white envelope bearing the HOA's logo, it outlined a formal request for Julian to remove her vineyard, citing concerns over non-compliance with aesthetic standards and a supposed clause about agricultural activity. Julian's stomach churned as she read the letter. The language was carefully worded, leaving little room for her to argue. But she knew it was baseless. There was no such clause, and she had every right to use her property as she saw fit. Julian responded with a letter of her own, outlining her compliance with the HOA guidelines and requesting clarification on their concerns. Days turned into weeks without a response. Then, one morning, she noticed something unsettling: a black SUV parked near the end of her street. It wasn't a car she recognized, and its presence felt out of place in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Over the next few days, the SUV appeared again, always idling at a distance. Julian dismissed it at first, convincing herself it was unrelated. But a growing sense of unease began to creep in. The second letter arrived a week later, this time more aggressive in tone. It accused Julian of ignoring multiple warnings and threatened escalation of enforcement actions if she didn't comply. This time, Julian felt a flicker of fear. She had heard stories about overreaching HOAs, neighbors losing their homes over trivial disputes, small disagreements spiraling into costly legal battles. But she also felt a surge of defiance. She wouldn't be bullied into submission. As summer turned to fall, the tension reached a boiling point. Julian awoke one morning to the sound of machinery outside her window. Heart pounding, she rushed to her backyard, only to find a group of workers dismantling her vineyard. They moved with cold efficiency, cutting down vines and hauling them away as though they were nothing more than weeds. Julian shouted at them to stop, but they ignored her, claiming they were acting under orders from the HOA. The destruction was swift and brutal. Within hours, her vineyard, months of work, years of dreams, was reduced to a barren patch of soil. Julian stood in the wreckage, her hands trembling with rage and disbelief. This wasn't just an overreach, it was a calculated attack. And in that moment, she made a decision. She wouldn't let them get away with this. If the HOA wanted a fight, they had picked the wrong person to cross. The destruction of Julian's vineyard left her in a state of shock and fury. For hours after the workers left, she stood in the barren dirt, staring at the empty trellises and the remnants of vines that had once promised life and beauty. It felt personal, almost vindictive, as if the HOA had gone out of their way to rip not just the plants from the ground, but the soul of her project. Julian's mind raced, searching for answers. Why would they go to such extremes? What had she done to deserve this level of hostility? The faint sound of a car door slamming brought her back to reality. She glanced up and saw the same black SUV parked at the end of the street, its windows tinted, its engine idling like an ominous shadow. Julian stormed inside, her hands trembling as she dialed the HOA's office. The line rang twice before a crisp, detached voice answered, identifying herself as the HOA office manager. Julian wasted no time. "I need to speak with Robert Longstreet immediately," she demanded, her voice sharp with restrained anger. There was a brief pause before the woman replied, "Mr. Longstreet is currently unavailable. If this is about the enforcement action on your property." "Enforcement action?" Julian snapped. "You mean the illegal destruction of my vineyard? How dare you come onto my property without warning, without even a proper explanation? I want answers now." The office manager's tone remained infuriatingly calm. "Ms. Myers, the board has sent multiple notices regarding the non-compliance of your vineyard. As outlined in the bylaws, failure to address these concerns gives the HOA the authority to take corrective measures." "You've sent nothing but vague threats," Julian retorted. "There's no bylaw that prohibits my vineyard, and you know it. This was a targeted attack, and I will not let it go unchallenged." The manager sighed, as though Julian's outrage was nothing more than a tedious inconvenience. "If you wish to dispute the board's decision, you may submit an appeal in writing. The board will review it at their next scheduled meeting." "An appeal?" Julian's voice rose. "You think I'm going to quietly write a letter while you bulldoze my property? I'm taking this to court." The manager's reply was cold and dismissive. "That is your right, Ms. Myers. Good day." The line went dead. Julian stared at her phone, the silence ringing in her ears. The sheer arrogance of it all made her blood boil. This wasn't just an overreach of authority, it was a blatant abuse of power. She grabbed a notebook and began jotting down everything she could remember about the incident: the time the workers arrived, their refusal to stop, the cryptic justification they offered about orders from the HOA. She listed every interaction she'd had with Longstreet and the office manager, every letter she'd received. If they wanted a fight, she would make sure she had every piece of evidence ready to bring them down. The following morning, Julian drove to the local courthouse to begin the process of filing a formal complaint. While waiting in line, she noticed a man in a dark suit standing near the entrance, speaking into his phone. Something about him felt familiar. When she reached the counter and began explaining her situation to the clerk, she saw the man glance in her direction, before quickly turning away and leaving the building. Her unease deepened. Was someone following her movements now? After filing her complaint, Julian returned home, determined to investigate further. She spent hours combing through the HOA's bylaws, searching for any justification they might have used to target her vineyard. As she suspected, there was no specific rule prohibiting vineyards or agricultural activity. The closest mention was a vague clause about maintaining aesthetic harmony within the community, an argument that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. It became clear to Julian that the HOA had acted far outside their authority. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While organizing her papers, Julian noticed that one of the envelopes from the HOA contained a handwritten note tucked behind the official letter. The note read, "They'll take what they can profit from." Look deeper. It wasn't signed, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, but it sent a chill down Julian's spine. Someone on the inside knew what was happening and was trying to warn her. Her first instinct was to contact a lawyer. She called a local attorney, Ben Stanley, who specialized in property disputes. When she explained her situation, he listened intently, asking pointed questions about the HOA's actions and the timeline of events. "This sounds highly irregular," he said. "They'd need to justify their actions with a clear violation, and from what you're telling me, they don't have one." Julian felt a flicker of hope. "Then we can fight this, right?" Ben hesitated. "We can, but HOAs are notorious for playing dirty. They have legal teams on retainer, and they'll use every loophole available to drag this out. If we go forward, it'll be a battle, but one we can win if we gather enough evidence." Julian didn't hesitate. "I'm in. Let's bring them down." Over the next few days, Ben began digging into the HOA's records while Julian reached out to her neighbors, hoping to find anyone who had experienced similar treatment. To her surprise, several of them came forward with stories of their own: fines for minor infractions, sudden rule changes, and unexplained fees. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Linda, shared that she'd nearly lost her home when the HOA tried to foreclose on her property over a $100 late fee. "Did you fight them?" Julian asked. Linda shook her head, her voice trembling. "I didn't have the money for a lawyer. They pressured me into paying, even though I knew it wasn't fair." Julian's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her vineyard anymore. It was about standing up to an organization that thrived on intimidation and exploitation. Then came the twist she hadn't anticipated. Ben called late one evening with news that made her stomach drop. "I've been looking into the workers who destroyed your vineyard," he said. "Turns out, they weren't just any contractors. They were hired through a third party that has ties to a private biotech company." Julian's heart raced. "Biotech? What does that have to do with my vineyard?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Ben said. "But here's the thing, they specialize in genetic research. My guess? They were after your plants." The realization hit Julian like a freight train. Her vineyard hadn't been destroyed because of aesthetics or bylaws. It had been targeted. The hybrid vines she'd been cultivating were unique, the result of years of experimentation. Someone in the HOA had seen an opportunity to profit from her work and seized it. Fueled by a mix of rage and determination, Julian knew she couldn't stop now. If they wanted a war, she would give them one, and she wouldn't rest until the truth came to light. Julian Myers had barely processed Ben's revelation about the biotech company when her world tilted even further. The destruction of her vineyard wasn't just about aesthetics or HOA control, it was a calculated move to profit off her years of work. The hybrids she cultivated were the product of a decade of research, and now someone else was trying to claim them. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room surrounded by the remnants of her notes and plans, combing through her records for anything that might explain how the HOA had become involved with a biotech firm. Every passing hour only fueled her anger and sharpened her resolve. By morning, Julian decided she couldn't wait for the legal process to unfold at its usual, sluggish pace. If the HOA was willing to play dirty, she would have to outmaneuver them. First, she contacted Ben, who was already busy digging deeper into the connection between the HOA and the third-party contractor that had destroyed her vineyard. We need proof that this wasn't random, she told him. Something that shows their motivation, why they targeted me specifically. I've been working on that, Ben said. There's a pattern here. I found other cases where the HOA targeted homeowners for seemingly minor infractions, only for their property to end up in the hands of a connected party. Your case is unique because of the biotech angle, but the method is the same. They create a problem, escalate it, and then someone profits. Julian felt her stomach churn. This isn't just corruption, it's a system. They're exploiting people. It gets worse, Ben said grimly. I managed to pull some contractor logs from the company that removed your vines. There's a trail leading back to a consulting firm that specializes in sourcing genetic materials for research. My guess? Someone flagged your vineyard as valuable. Julian's mind raced. You're saying the HOA sold me out? They handed over my work to some lab for profit? Not directly, Ben said, but someone in the HOA made it possible. They knew what they were doing. The revelation lit a fire under Julian. She wasn't going to let them get away with this. She started by reaching out to neighbors who might have witnessed the destruction of her vineyard or noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to it. Most were hesitant to get involved after all. Going up against the HOA was a risk many weren't willing to take. But one neighbor, Marjorie, pulled Julian aside and whispered, I saw a black van parked by your property the night before it happened. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seemed like they were scoping out your yard. Julian pressed for more details, but Marjorie didn't have much else to offer. Still, it was a lead, and Julian wasn't about to let it go. That evening, she reviewed the footage from the security camera she'd installed weeks earlier after the first HOA threats. As she scanned the clips, her heart raced. There it was. A black van, parked near her fence line, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A shadowy figure stepped out, inspecting her property under the cover of night. She sent the footage to Ben immediately. This is what they're doing, she said. They were planning this from the start. The following day, Julian's sense of unease grew stronger. Her mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes, some taunting, others outright threatening. You should have listened, one note read. Another warned, you don't know who you're dealing with. She tried to shake off the fear, but the tension was suffocating. When she saw the black SUV idling near her house again, her frustration boiled over. Grabbing her phone, she marched outside and began recording. The moment the driver saw her approach, the car sped off, disappearing down the street. Julian didn't care if she was being reckless. She wasn't going to cower in the face of intimidation. Instead, she decided to push back harder. With Ben's help, she organized a community meeting, inviting neighbors to share their experiences with the HOA. To her surprise, more than 20 people showed up. Some were hesitant to speak at first, but as the meeting progressed, the stories started pouring out. An elderly couple recounted how they'd been fined thousands of dollars for having a fence that was an inch too high, only for the HOA to demand they sell their property when they couldn't pay. A single mother described how her yard was deemed non-compliant because of her children's playset, which the HOA claimed violated visual harmony standards. One man admitted he'd sold his house at a loss after the HOA bombarded him with fines for trivial issues like leaving his trash bins out too long. It was a floodgate of grievances, and the common thread was clear. The HOA was wielding its power as a weapon, targeting residents for profit. Julian felt a surge of determination as she listened to their stories. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice steady but fierce. They're using their authority to exploit us, but we can fight back together. The meeting galvanized some of the neighbors, but others were more cautious. You don't understand, one man said nervously. They'll come after us even harder if we speak out. I've seen it happen. Julian knew the risks, but she also knew that silence would only enable the HOA's behavior. With the support of those willing to stand with her, she began compiling testimonies, gathering evidence, and building a case that exposed the HOA's systematic abuses. Ben filed a formal complaint on behalf of the group, requesting an investigation into the HOA's practices. But the HOA wasn't about to back down. Days after the meeting, Julian woke to find her yard littered with debris, broken branches, scraps of metal, and a spray-painted message on her driveway, "Back off." It was a clear warning, but Julian refused to be intimidated. Instead, she doubled down, reaching out to local media outlets to share her story. Within a week, a local news station picked up the story, and Julian found herself in front of a camera, recounting the destruction of her vineyard and the harassment she'd faced since. The segment aired that evening, drawing immediate attention from the community and beyond. Neighbors began speaking out publicly, emboldened by the coverage. The pressure was mounting, and the HOA's response was swift. They issued a statement denying all allegations, painting Julian as a troublemaker who refused to follow community standards. But the statement backfired. Journalists started digging deeper, uncovering connections between the HOA board members and the contractors hired to destroy Julian's vineyard. As the truth began to surface, Julian felt the tides shifting. The HOA was on the defensive, their carefully constructed facade of authority cracking under the weight of scrutiny. But Julian knew the fight was far from over. The deeper she dug, the more she realized just how far the corruption went, and she was prepared to go all the way to expose it. Julian Myers felt like she was finally gaining ground, but the deeper she delved into the fight against the HOA, the more tangled the web of corruption became. The footage of the black van and the mounting testimonies from her neighbors were starting to paint a damning picture, but she knew she needed more than circumstantial evidence to bring the HOA and their hidden allies to justice. Ben had warned her from the start, they'll use every legal loophole, every procedural technicality, to shield themselves. If we don't find something concrete, something they can't refute, they'll find a way to escape accountability. Motivated by Ben's words, Julian doubled her efforts. She spent hours each night combing through the HOA's bylaws, public financial records, and county filings. The more she looked, the more irregularities she found. Payments made to contractors were listed under vague descriptions, and expenses labeled as community maintenance didn't align with any visible improvements in the neighborhood. But the most glaring discovery was a series of payments made to a company called Arden Biosolutions. Julian's stomach tightened when she saw the name. Arden Biosolutions was a well-known biotech company that had been linked to several controversial genetic research projects. She remembered Ben mentioning a biotech angle earlier, and now the pieces began to fall into place. The HOA wasn't just destroying her vineyard to make a point, they were working with Arden to profit off her unique hybrids. But how could she prove it? She decided to call Ben immediately. "I found something," she said as soon as he picked up. Payments from the HOA to a biotech firm called Arden Biosolutions. They're not listed as a vendor for anything related to the neighborhood. This has to be connected to what happened to my vineyard. Ben was silent for a moment, then replied, "That's a major lead. If we can tie those payments to the destruction of your vineyard, we'll have a solid case. I'll start pulling everything I can on Arden and their connection to the HOA. In the meantime, I want you to stay alert. If they realize you're getting close to exposing them, they could escalate things." Julian knew Ben was right. The HOA had already shown they weren't above intimidation tactics. Over the next few days, she noticed the black sub making more frequent appearances near her house. Her mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes, some warning her to drop it, and others laced with veiled threats. Julian refused to be scared off, but she couldn't ignore the tension that hung over her every move. Then came the unexpected breakthrough. Late one evening, as Julian was organizing her notes, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ms. Myers?" a nervous voice asked. "You don't know me, but I work with the HOA. Or at least I used to. I've been following what's happening, and I think you deserve to know the truth." Julian's heart raced. "Who is this?" she asked cautiously. "I can't give you my name," the voice replied. "But I was at the meeting where they decided to destroy your vineyard. It wasn't about the HOA bylaws or aesthetics. They were contacted by Arden Biosolutions months ago. Arden wanted access to your vines for research, and the HOA agreed to help in exchange for a donation." Julian's grip on the phone tightened. "A donation? How much?" "Enough to pay off some of their debts," the voice said bitterly. "The HOA has been mismanaging funds for years. When Arden came along, it was their chance to fix the books at your expense. They justified it by saying you were non-compliant, but they knew that wasn't true. They knew exactly what they were doing. The whistleblower explained that the HOA had been funneling money into Arden's projects while covering their tracks with fraudulent invoices. They don't think you can prove it, the voice added. But there are records, emails, meeting minutes, contracts. They're stored in a digital archive on the HOA's internal server. If you can get access to those, you'll have everything you need. Julian's mind raced. Why are you telling me this? Because it's wrong, the voice replied. And because they'll destroy more than just your vineyard if they get away with it. The call ended, leaving Julian reeling. She immediately called Ben and relayed everything the whistleblower had told her. This is huge, Ben said, his voice laced with urgency. If those records exist, we need to get them before they're erased. Do you know anyone who could help us access the HOA's servers? Julian hesitated. She wasn't exactly tech-savvy, but she remembered a neighbor, Ethan, who worked in IT. She reached out to him the next day, explaining the situation without revealing too many details. Ethan agreed to help, though he was clearly nervous about crossing the HOA can get into their system, he said. But if they find out, it'll be traced back to me. Are you sure this is worth it? It's worth it, Julian said firmly. I'll take full responsibility if anything goes wrong. That evening, Ethan came over with his laptop and began accessing the HOA's digital archive. It took hours of navigating encrypted files and firewalls, but eventually he found what they were looking for, a folder labeled Special Projects. Inside were contracts between the HOA and Arden Biosolutions, detailing the transfer of Julian's hybrids for genetic exploration and a payment of $250,000 to the HOA. There were also emails between Robert Longstreet and an Arden representative discussing the timeline for the vineyard's destruction and even joking about the inconvenience Julian would face. Julian's stomach churned as she read the emails. It was all there, the proof she needed to expose the HOA's corruption. She sent copies of the documents to Ben, who immediately began preparing their case. This is more than enough to take them to court, he said. But we need to move fast. If they realize we have this, they'll try to discredit you or worse. Julian knew he was right. Over the next few days, she noticed a sharp increase in the HOA's attempts to intimidate her. She received a formal notice accusing her of violating neighborhood noise ordinances, even though she hadn't hosted any gatherings. A neighbor she barely knew knocked on her door, delivering a vague warning to leave well enough alone. And then, one night, she heard footsteps outside her house and saw shadows moving near her fence. Julian refused to back down. She installed additional security cameras around her property and started documenting every interaction with the HOA, no matter how minor. At the same time, Ben began contacting local media outlets, sharing the evidence they had uncovered. Within days, the story exploded. News headlines called out the HOA's corruption, and Arden Biosolutions faced public scrutiny for their role in the scandal. But Julian knew the fight wasn't over. Longstreet and the HOA board issued a statement denying all allegations, claiming the documents had been fabricated and accusing Julian of orchestrating a smear campaign. It was a bold move, but Julian was ready. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't about to let them twist it. As the case gained momentum, Julian felt a surge of determination. The battle was far from over, but for the first time she felt like victory was within reach. The HOA had underestimated her resolve, and now they were about to face the consequences. The public exposure of the HOA's corruption sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, but instead of retreating, the HOA doubled down. Their next move was swift and ruthless. Julian received a formal cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal team, accusing her of defamation and fabricating the evidence she had presented to the media. The letter threatened her with a countersuit, demanding a retraction of her statements and an apology to the board. Julian read the letter twice, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. The message was clear. The HOA was trying to intimidate her into silence. Julian forwarded the letter to Ben, who responded almost immediately. "This is exactly what I expected," he said. "They're hoping you'll panic and back down, but they've got nothing to stand on. All of the evidence we've uncovered is legitimate, and they know it. This is a bluff, but we need to respond strategically." While Ben worked on crafting a formal reply, Julian began noticing more overt acts of retaliation. Early one morning, she found her trash cans overturned, their contents scattered across her driveway. At first, she thought it might have been an accident, but then it happened again, and this time, someone had spray-painted a crude message on her garage door. Liar. She filed a police report and had the graffiti cleaned, but the feeling of being targeted lingered. Things escalated further when a group of HOA board members, led by Longstreet himself, began canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, spreading their version of the story and attempting to turn the community against Julian. Neighbors who had previously expressed support for her started to withdraw, their smiles replaced with wary glances. One evening, Marjorie, her elderly neighbor, stopped by to warn her. "They're saying you're trying to ruin the HOA for personal gain," Marjorie said, her voice low, "that you're exaggerating everything to get attention." Julian felt a mix of frustration and determination. "They're lying to protect themselves," she said. "But I'm not stopping until the truth comes out." Marjorie nodded but looked nervous. "Be careful, Julian. They're getting desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things." The warning proved prescient. A few days later, Julian returned home from running errands to find an HOA contractor's truck parked in front of her house. Two workers were in her backyard, digging up what remained of the soil where her vineyard once stood. Julian stormed outside, demanding to know what they were doing. One of the workers shrugged, holding up a clipboard. "We've got orders from the HOA to remediate the area," he said. "They're claiming it's contaminated and needs to be leveled." "Contaminated?" Julian's voice was sharp with disbelief. "That's absurd. Get off my property, or I'm calling the police." The workers hesitated, but when Julian pulled out her phone and started recording, they quickly retreated. She sent the video to Ben, who was equally outraged. "They're trying to destroy any remaining evidence," he said. "They know the soil samples could prove your hybrids were here. We'll add this to the case." The confrontation only strengthened Julian's resolve. She decided to take the fight directly to the HOA. At the next public HOA meeting, she showed up with a stack of evidence and a camera crew from a local news station that had been following her story. As she entered the room, Longstreet's expression darkened, and the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Julian wasted no time. "For weeks I've been harassed, intimidated, and targeted by this board," she began, her voice steady but firm. "You've destroyed my property, threatened me, and tried to cover up your corruption. But the truth is out, and you won't silence me." Longstreet leaned forward, his tone smug. "Ms. Myers, this is a private matter. Public grandstanding won't change the fact that your vineyard violated community standards, and we acted within our rights." Julian smirked, holding up a folder. "Community standards? Let's talk about those. I've reviewed every bylaw in your charter, and there's nothing that prohibits what I planted." "What you did wasn't about standards, it was about money. Specifically, the $250,000 payment you received from Arden Biosolutions in exchange for destroying my hybrids." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Julian handed copies of the evidence to the board members and the reporters. "These contracts and emails show exactly what happened. You sold out this community for personal gain. And if you think I'm backing down, think again. This is going to court, and I'll make sure every homeowner here knows the truth." Longstreet's composure cracked for a moment before he regained control. "These documents are fabricated," he said flatly. "We've already filed a countersuit for defamation. I suggest you lawyer up, Ms. Myers, because this is far from over." But the tension in the room had shifted. Some of the neighbors previously silent began voicing their frustrations. "Is it true?" one man demanded. "Have you been taking bribes?" Another shouted, "We deserve answers." The meeting descended into chaos as residents began confronting the board. Julian left feeling a small sense of victory, but she knew the real battle was yet to come. Longstreet wouldn't go down without a fight, and the stakes were getting higher by the day. The next morning, Julian woke to find a bright yellow notice taped to her front door. It was from the HOA, claiming she had violated neighborhood rules by hosting an unauthorized assembly at the meeting. The notice threatened fines and further legal action. Julian laughed bitterly as she read it. They were clearly trying to rattle her, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Ben called later that day with an update. "I've filed motions to request the HOA's financial records and internal communications," he said. "If they try to hide or destroy anything, it'll work against them in court. In the meantime, I suggest we get a forensic analysis of the soil from your vineyard site. If we can prove it was tampered with, it'll strengthen our case." Julian agreed, and by the end of the week she had a team of experts examining the remaining soil. What they found was shocking: traces of chemicals commonly used in genetic modification experiments. The evidence was undeniable. Arden Biosolutions had already begun working with the plants before the vineyard was destroyed. The discovery reignited media interest in the case, putting even more pressure on the HOA. Longstreet and the board issued another statement, denying any wrongdoing and accusing Julian of orchestrating a witch hunt. But the damage was done. Residents began calling for Longstreet's resignation, and several neighbors approached Julian privately to offer their support. Despite the mounting tension, Julian knew she couldn't relax. The HOA had already shown they were willing to play dirty, and she had no doubt they would escalate their tactics. But for the first time, she felt like the tide was turning. She wasn't just fighting for her vineyard anymore, she was fighting for accountability, justice, and the community's future. The battle wasn't over, but Julian was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed. Residents from the neighborhood, journalists, and even strangers who had followed Julian's story filed in, their whispers creating an electric buzz. Julian sat at the plaintiff's table next to Ben, her stomach tight with anticipation. Across the room sat Robert Longstreet and the HOA's legal team, their expressions cold and calculated. Despite their confident facade, Julian could sense the unease beneath the surface. They knew the weight of the evidence against them, but they would fight tooth and nail to keep their grip on the community and their secrets. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and the trial began. Ben started with a sharp, concise opening statement. "This case is about more than one woman's destroyed property," he said. "It's about corruption, exploitation, and an abuse of power that has poisoned this community for far too long. The defendants used their authority not to protect the neighborhood, but to enrich themselves at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve." Longstreet's lawyer, a polished man with a practiced charm, delivered a rebuttal that painted Julian as a troublemaker who had willfully violated HOA guidelines and fabricated evidence to smear the board. Julian gritted her teeth as the attorney's words twisted the narrative, but Ben squeezed her arm lightly, a silent reminder to stay calm. Their turn to dismantle those lies was coming. The heart of the trial came when Ben began presenting the evidence. He started with the contracts between the HOA and Arden Biosolutions, which detailed the payment the biotech firm made in exchange for access to Julian's hybrids. The documents clearly showed that the vineyard was targeted not because of noncompliance, but because the HOA saw an opportunity to profit. Ben walked the judge through the emails between Longstreet and Arden representatives, pointing out the flippant tone as they discussed destroying Julian's work. "These aren't the words of a board acting in good faith," Ben said. "These are the words of people treating a homeowner's property and her life's work as a commodity to be sold." Longstreet's lawyer tried to discredit the evidence, suggesting the emails could have been fabricated. But Ben was ready. He had subpoenaed the HOA's digital records, including metadata that verified the authenticity of the correspondence. When he presented this to the court, Longstreet's lawyer faltered, his confidence visibly shaken. Then came the testimony of the whistleblower. The room fell silent as the former HOA employee, a nervous woman in her late 30s, took the stand. She detailed how she had attended the secret meetings where the vineyard's destruction was planned, recounting how Longstreet had laughed about the ease with which they could cover their tracks. "He said Julian Myers wouldn't stand a chance," the whistleblower said, her voice trembling but firm. "That even if she fought back, they'd drown her in legal fees until she gave up." Longstreet's lawyer attempted to paint the whistleblower as disgruntled and unreliable, but Ben countered with a mountain of evidence that corroborated her claims. Every email, contract, and financial record aligned with her testimony, leaving little room for doubt. The turning point came when Ben introduced the forensic soil analysis. The experts who had examined the remnants of Julian's vineyard testified that the soil contained traces of chemicals used in genetic modification. proving that Arden had already begun experimenting with the hybrids before the vineyard was destroyed. This revelation sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. It wasn't just about money, it was about theft, deceit, and scientific exploitation. Longstreet was called to the stand, his demeanor icy but controlled. Under Ben's questioning, he deflected responsibility, claiming he had acted in the best interest of the community and had no knowledge of the specifics of the deal with Arden. But Ben was relentless. He presented email chains where Longstreet had personally approved the destruction of the vineyard and negotiated the payment from Arden. Caught in his own lies, Longstreet's composure began to crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his responses grew clipped and defensive. As the trial stretched into its final day, Julian felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. She had spent months fighting an uphill battle against a powerful and corrupt organization, but now the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Ben delivered a powerful closing argument, emphasizing not just the personal injustice Julian had suffered, but the broader implications of the HOA's actions. This board betrayed the trust of the very people they were supposed to protect, he said. They turned this community into a marketplace for their own gain, and they did it by trampling over the rights of a woman who simply wanted to pursue her passion. This stops here. The defense's closing argument leaned heavily on portraying Julian as a troublemaker who refused to abide by community standards, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The judge adjourned to deliberate, leaving the room buzzing with anticipation. Julian sat with Ben, her heart pounding as she waited for the decision. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. In a measured tone, he delivered the verdict. The HOA was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and illegal destruction of private property. The contracts with Arden Biosolutions were deemed unethical and void, and the HOA was ordered to pay substantial damages to Julian, including the full value of her vineyard and additional compensation for emotional distress. Longstreet himself was held personally liable for his role in the corruption and faced the possibility of criminal charges pending further investigation. The courtroom erupted in whispers as the ruling sank in. Julian felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of relief and vindication washing over her. Longstreet slumped in his chair, his once confident demeanor shattered. As she walked out of the courtroom, the reporters swarmed her, but she barely registered their questions. All she could think about was that she had won not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced and exploited by the HOA's abuse of power. That evening, Julian returned home, standing in the empty space where her vineyard once thrived. The fight had been brutal, but she had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her right to stand up for what she believed in. And in the quiet of her backyard, she made a promise to herself she would rebuild, stronger and more determined than ever. The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind of relief and reflection for Julian Mayers. The courtroom victory had brought an end to her legal battle, but the emotional scars and the physical devastation of her vineyard remained. She spent her days in a state of cautious optimism, juggling interviews with reporters, organizing the compensation awarded by the court, and reconnecting with neighbors who had offered their support during her fight. The once overbearing presence of the HOA seemed to evaporate overnight. Robert Longstreet had resigned in disgrace, and the remaining board members, now under intense scrutiny, were scrambling to repair the HOA's shattered reputation. Julian's name had become synonymous with resilience and justice. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up now openly approached her, some apologizing for their earlier hesitation, others simply expressing admiration. Marjorie, her elderly neighbor, brought over a batch of cookies one afternoon, her eyes twinkling. "You've done something remarkable, Julian," she said. "You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." Despite the support, Julian couldn't shake the lingering heaviness in her heart. The vineyard had been her sanctuary, a labor of love that had been torn away in an instant. Even with the damages awarded by the court, she knew it would take time to rebuild not just the vines, but the spirit of what they represented. Yet as she stood in her backyard, staring at the barren soil, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: hope. The turning point came when a group of neighbors, led by Ethan, the IT specialist who had helped uncover the HOA's files, proposed a community project. "We want to help you rebuild," he said one evening, standing on her doorstep with a folder of ideas. "Not just your vineyard, but something bigger, something that represents what this neighborhood can be when we work together." The idea was to transform her backyard into a shared community garden and vineyard, blending her expertise with the collective energy of her neighbors. At first, Julian was hesitant. The vineyard had been her personal dream, something deeply tied to her identity and her past. But the more she listened to Ethan's vision, the more she saw the potential for something greater. This wasn't just about reclaiming her property, it was about healing the neighborhood and redefining what community meant. Within weeks, the project was underway. Neighbors of all ages came together, hauling soil, planting seeds, and building trellises under Julian's guidance. The space began to transform, row by row, into a vibrant blend of grapevines, flowers, and vegetable patches. It wasn't the vineyard Julian had originally envisioned, but in many ways, it was more meaningful. It was a testament to resilience, collaboration, and the power of standing up to injustice. The whole, now under new leadership, was noticeably quieter in its approach. The remaining board members issued a public apology to Julian and the neighborhood, promising to implement reforms and increase transparency in their operations. It was a small victory, but an important one. Julian didn't trust the organization, but she took solace in knowing that her fight had sparked real change. The grand reopening of the vineyard and garden was a celebration unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Julian hosted a small event, inviting neighbors and friends to gather in the newly transformed space. Lanterns hung from the trellises, casting a warm glow over the rows of young vines and blooming flowers. Laughter and conversation filled the air as children ran between the rows, and adults sipped wine donated by a local vineyard inspired by Julian's story. As the evening wore on, Julian stood at the edge of the garden, watching the scene unfold. Marjorie approached her, a glass of wine in hand. "You did it," she said, her voice full of pride. "We did it," Julian corrected with a smile. For the first time in months, Julian felt a sense of peace. The vineyard had started as her personal sanctuary, but it had grown into something far more powerful, a symbol of resilience and the strength of community. Standing in the garden that evening, surrounded by the people who had stood with her, Julian knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Together, they had reclaimed their neighborhood, their dignity, and their hope. And in the rows of young vines stretching out before her, she saw not just a fresh start, but a future full of promise.